Statistically speaking, you're probably bad at Skyblock, and in this video, iCheppy found some excuses and people to blame that on. Without further ado, let's get into it.
The most tedious part of Skyblock is the early game. The transition to late game or even mid game is currently very difficult for most Skyblock players. From the very beginning, players are forced to face a large number of difficult concepts, overall toxicity, and severe lack of organized and helpful information. Add a superinflated economy due to macros, a devaluation of coins, and you're at a pretty horrible start. That's not how Hypixel Skyblock should be. First, let's define a difference between a good player and a bad player. Contrary to popular belief, I don't think that you're required to have a high net worth or skill average to be considered a good player. Those two things can be bought without much hassle. Instead, I would consider a good player to be someone who has a lot of Skyblock related knowledge, basic logic, problem solving skills, and common sense. If you're fortunate enough to already have or obtain such skills, then it's easy to achieve anything else that is relevant. With all the qualities I mentioned, and knowledge especially, a player should be able to make smart financial decisions, be aware of all current metas, and be able to come up with his or her own if needed. A bad player is missing all or some parts of that. They're clueless about what's going on in the current meta. They're unable to predict even the most obvious things. They're missing a lot of essential knowledge and experience in general, and as a result, they make extremely questionable decisions throughout their Skyblock journey. These are generally the types of people who fall victim to scams that otherwise would have been easily avoided. Tens of development paths, each straining in its own direction, scare all players, making players flee Skyblock even before they reach the most fun part of it. When a player starts their Skyblock journey, they are in the early game. They're thrown into a giant pit of toxicity and scammers. Based on my observation, there is always someone in the lobby who is more than welcome to scam a noob for an AOTE. And probably only 10% of players are rich enough not to care. A new player is easily scammable and usually doesn't know what they're doing, but you can't blame them for that. There is little to no guidance in the game, which would aid new players. There is no system that would familiarize a player with concepts like reforging, selling items, and simple progression. They're left to deal with this incomprehensible amount of incoming information, or perhaps its lack. Or they have a choice to look for an easy way to get better and richer. That's how macros, IRL traders, and scammers are produced. They're just players who weren't able to find their place in Skyblock, which made them retreat to a simpler, clearer, but also bannable method of making money. Everyone is annoyed by players who think that boss trading is bad, or new players complaining in the lobby that they got scammed. Our current system creates a huge knowledge gap between all the new players, and frankly, I think that harms both groups. There is severe misunderstanding and frustration when two opposing opinions collide. Reversing or at least equalizing the difficulty level may also increase the overall enjoyment for players of all stages, and naturally decrease the amount of nonsense all players have to deal with every single day. Now, when many people maxed out their accounts by reaching the complete endgame, it is my belief that it's time for a more difficult challenge for pros and time to flatten the learning curve for the rookies. You might have already noticed, but I have been talking a lot about the issues but not the solutions. At this point, I think it's too late to change anything, simply because you cannot remove a huge update from Skyblock. Personally, I think dungeons were one of the worst updates in Skyblock. Not only because it took 8 months, but because it messed up the power creep and they didn't really make dungeons player friendly. The two biggest issues with dungeons are price of the items and class levels. If you're just starting out dungeons, it's going to be a pain. Not only for new players, but for those who don't have much prior experience with dungeons. I've been sitting with my hands in my pockets doing nothing useful until Floor 5 came out, and when I actually wanted to play, I spent a large sum of money on dungeon gear, but no one wanted to play with me because I was very low level. I'm seeing many people that have the same or similar problem. For instance, Mashclash, a fellow content creator, has the exact same problem as me, which he addressed in this forum post. The problem I have roots to the beginning of dungeons. Dungeons is not welcoming to new players, especially if you don't own a group of players who are your Kata level. I'm only Kata 13. I decided I didn't want to do dungeons for a bit and went to grind some of my skills up. That was a terrible mistake. Now everyone is Kata 20, no one will play with me, and playing with randoms is basically impossible, so I just given up on dungeons. Of course, dungeons can be fun, but they also serve the purpose of a huge money sink. It could have been vastly improved in terms of power creep by making your performance more dependent on your Kata level, so that there would be no reason to add new overpowered items. And on top of that, players wouldn't have to spend tens of millions of coins just to be able to do dungeons. Yet another thing that hurts the majority of players are meta changes. In the last few updates, Skyblock developed a habit of making items OP, and then no sooner than later nerfing them. One of the most historically significant nerfs ever made was the nerf of the Midas Sword. By adding 2 new better weapons, the Livid Dagger and the Shadow Fury, the Midas received an indirect but very significant nerf. Now it's just weak and inefficient. For the price of just 14 million coins, you can buy a Livid Dagger, which is arguably the same or even better than a 50 mil Midas. Of course, this made the price of Midases plummet. Put yourself in a situation where you have been grinding Summoning Eyes for months, earning enough coins to afford a tier 6 50 mil Midas. Now, incidentally, right after you bought one, Floor 5 was released. The price dropped and you lost a significant amount of money and the work you put into it. You might think this is a one-time example where an item became obsolete. In fact, that happened to the overwhelming majority of early game items. Currently, there are 1 or 2 usable armor sets in the early game, depending on whether you consider End Armor an early game set. Don't get me wrong here, consistent metas unconditionally lead to stagnation in the game. There is nothing bad about changing how some things work, but sometimes metas are being changed back and forth without much thought put into it. Just by looking at the stats of a Livid Dagger, you can tell it's OP as heck and needs a nerf. If that was seen earlier in the development process and fixed, maybe there wouldn't be a need to change it again after it was implemented in the game.
Thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more epic content.